back again to our humble show. Colonel Macgregor, now CEO of Our Country, Our Choice as well. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But first, I would like to, if you could give us an update on Ukraine since we last spoke. It's becoming more obvious to the average person that this isn't going so well for the West. And especially, if you could say something about the death toll of Ukraine and Russian soldiers, because I hear people saying anything from 50,000 to 500,000. I know you're at the higher end of the spectrum. How can we do the math here to make sense of this?
Well, what I've seen analysts do, and a couple of the analysts that I depend upon, look at all of the death notices in the newspapers. So obviously you have to have someone who speaks Ukrainian and Russian and writes it fluently. And fortunately, I have that with me. And you look at the death notices, the obituaries, you look at the cemeteries. We have space-based imagery of cemeteries that have been radically expanded to accommodate an additional 150,000 dead, this sort of thing. Then you also can look at some of the reports that come in. I would tell you that my experience has been that the Russians have actually been pretty straightforward and honest in their assessments. In fact, on more than one occasion, we concluded that Putin, when he spoke and announced numbers along with Lavrov or Shoigu, were actually lowballing the numbers, that the Ukrainian losses were higher. Russian losses have never been high. They've always been modest. There have been a few days when they've been larger, but you're looking at less than 100,000 casualties for the entire war, and of that number, perhaps just less than 50,000 dead. Russians may have taken as few killed in action as 35,000. So when you go to the Ukrainian side, you're listening to people who have carefully studied what they can find and what they know to be true based on overhead imagery, as well as what I discussed before. And the general consensus now is it's probably between 450,000 and 500,000 dead. No one is really sure of how many are wounded. The difference between wounded on the Russian side and wounded on the Ukrainian side is profound. And the reason for that is that many Ukrainians die of their wounds. Ukrainians, in many cases, are far more seriously wounded than the Russian soldiers. And what is really tragic is that the Ukrainians don't have the capacity to evacuate the wounded in a timely fashion. They've run out of medical support in many cases. It's gotten so bad that a Ukrainian officer or soldier who is severely wounded has to literally bribe people to put him in an ambulance and take him to a hospital. Now, Ukraine's always been horribly corrupt, but this is ridiculous in the middle of a war, bribing the people on the battlefield that are driving ambulances to take you to a real hospital for real treatment. I think whatever I've said, the situation in Ukraine is really worse. I think the war is effectively over. The Russians not only hold the strategic initiative, but they have a force of roughly 1 million men now, 750,000 in southern Ukraine and around Ukraine. And I think that total is going to go up to about 1.2 million before they're through. So the question is, why don't the Russians attack? And there are two answers to that. One is that they haven't had to because the Ukrainians have done them the favor of impaling themselves on Russian defenses. I mean, if your enemy is dumb enough to attack you relentlessly and you occupy what are effectively impregnable defenses, then by all means, don't interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. So that's quite clear. Secondly, the Russians have persistent surveillance all over the country. They have space-based intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms, just as we do. Theirs are narrowly focused on Ukraine. They know what's happening in the country. They can see everything. They can strike any target they care to whenever they want to. So they haven't felt compelled to do very much. But I think President Putin, who's been meeting with his top generals, is close to the decision to allow this force to move forward. Now, the question is, what does move forward mean? Putin, contrary to what people argued, has never been interested in marching west to the Polish border. The problem for President Putin and the Russians has been the unwillingness of anyone in the West to negotiate with them. And the more opposition they encounter from the West on that scale, the more land they feel obliged to take. They will undoubtedly seize Kharkov, and they will eventually cross the river and seize Odessa. Those are historically Russian cities. They were never part of Ukraine. So one will expect that to happen. The concern right now is if we don't come to some sort of agreement, in other words, we and the Europeans, or if we're not part of it, that's fine, the Europeans do it. Then the Russians will say, all right, well, we go to the river. We go into Kiev. Who's going to talk to us? Who's going to negotiate? Well, if no one negotiates with us, well, then we have to march further west. They absolutely don't want to do that because the Russians know the real Ukrainians, if you will, historically live in Western Ukraine. They don't want to be ruled by the Russians, and the Russians don't want to rule them. What they would like to have is some sort of arrangement for the rump Ukraine. As long as that rump Ukraine is not part of NATO and is ideally neutralized, and they have some modest say in who governs the place, and it's demilitarized, I don't think the Russians particularly care what people do in Western Ukraine. But the point is, how do we get to that stage where people in the West realize what I just said is true? Now, you mentioned, and others are beginning to tell me in Europe, that the truth is getting out, that people have finally figured out that this Ukraine war has been an utter and complete catastrophe. It's destroyed the Ukrainian nation for all intents and purposes, and it's done a lot of damage to Europe, as we both know, economically and socially. So perhaps this will carry over into some sort of demand for new government leadership that will step in and find a way to end this war with the Russians. I don't know. Nothing's coming out of Washington. Forget it.
Yeah, Germany is in a really, really tough situation, being deindustrialized at a fast pace. A lot of companies considering moving out, so it's very tragic. And of course, all of Europe depends on Germany. So I feel that. Do you think the Russians? You do actually think the Russians will go to Odessa and cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea?
Yes, Odessa is a Russian city. If you go back historically, it was, and these areas were seized from the Mongols and Tartars and Turks at the time that Catherine the Great seized the whole area along the Black Sea and Crimea. This is 1776, roughly. It was part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Crimean Tartars were a tributary state of the Ottoman Empire. They switched their allegiance once what was once called the Golden Horde, the Mongolian Empire, fell apart. And then the Crimean Tartars maintained some degree of modest autonomy until the 1840s. But the point is that there was nothing Ukrainian about these areas. The Ukrainians were further north into the heartland that we now call Western Ukraine. And that reached to the Dnieper River and a little further east down to the Cossack Sich state in the Dnieper River Valley. And that's it. That's historic Ukraine. And the Russians are not interested in ruling that. That's not their goal. Their goal was to secure their own country against the use of Ukraine as a weapon against Russia. That's largely accomplished. The key now is to consolidate that accomplishment, an agreement that keeps NATO and future enemies out of Western Ukraine. I think the Europeans can come to some sort of arrangement on that. I'm reassured finally by Polish behavior, because the Polish electorate has now turned against this war. I think having millions of Ukrainians in their country has helped them make that decision. That's another discussion point. But the bottom line is, I think we've reached now a strategic inflection point. Who in the West is going to stand up and say enough is enough and end this travesty? I don't know. Unfortunately, I see no evidence for anything intelligent coming out of Washington.
You don't see any waning of the support from Washington? I mean, there was a package of 200 million approved recently. That seems like change to me compared to what's previously been donated.
I think
you don't see them losing interest in this conflict.
I think people will lose interest, and I've always said that the war will end when Washington just quietly walks away. And I think that that will inevitably happen. I think we see the first signs of it, but that's not a settlement. That's not an arrangement that is designed to restore some measure of stability to the region. That does not end hostilities with Russia. You see, that's the problem. America has always, I mean, we and the British are very similar. We are maritime powers primarily. Also, the United States is a global aerospace power. We're not really a global land power. So for us to have been on the European continent for 75 years is more than anomalous. It's astonishing. And it's about to end, largely because we're broke. I mean, let's face it, we're on the verge of, finance implosion. It's coming. And the mainstream media continues to say, oh, no, it's not so bad. But you've got this 900-pound gorilla sitting in the corner. It's called the national sovereign debt. And right now, the annual payments on the national sovereign debt exceed the size of the United States defense budget, or roughly $1 trillion. We'll spend $1 trillion on defense if you include the intelligence agencies with that. The defense budget's about 820 billion. So you're looking at $1 trillion now, the equivalent of the Defense Department and the Intel Committee is almost $1 trillion on an annual basis. Is that sustainable? I don't think it's sustainable. So I think we're going to turn inwards, and we're going to have a lot of problems inside the United States.
Well, then you have the other engagements. You have things going on in Africa and Kosovo, and you have Taiwan coming up maybe, and you have Armenia and now Israel. So that's how empires go.
I think we can put the Taiwan thing to bed. The Chinese are not going to attack Taiwan. They have no interest in attacking Taiwan. That's nonsense. It was always nonsense. And I think the electorate on Taiwan, if given the opportunity, may well vote itself into China. That's what people don't understand. You've always had two parties there. One is pro-Japanese, the other is pro-Beijing. And the pro-Beijing party is strong enough now that that could happen. But there will be no war. The Chinese on the island of Taiwan don't want a war, and neither do the people on the mainland. This is a manufactured boogeyman straight out of Washington. So we ought to set that aside. And there is nothing aggressive about China militarily. They're aggressive economically, they're aggressive financially, but they're not aggressive militarily. Now, as far as Kosovo is concerned, that's a very legitimate concern. Because remember, this is another example of where we intervened, largely because we argued that the Europeans would not do what needed to be done. Of course, there are many people in Great Britain and France and other places that said, maybe we shouldn't do anything. Maybe we should let this sort itself out. We did not do that. So we created what I would call an unsustainable status quo, unsustainable unless you have permanently stationed foreign forces on the ground to maintain this unsustainable status quo. Well, that's not going to last. I think we'll pull out of Kosovo just as we're going to pull out of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It may be that other European forces will do the same eventually, and we'll see what happens. But I'm absolutely certain that what we see today is not the way things will look 10 years from now. The region will decide the outcome, the dynamics in the region. We deform those dynamics temporarily. We did that in Southeast Asia. Everywhere we go, we temporarily deform the natural dynamics, the natural balance of power. And once we leave, the whole thing vanishes. It's sort of like putting your hand in a bucket of water. And while your hand is in the water, you displace the water. You pull it out. Suddenly, it looks as though you were never there. Example, Vietnam. Example, Afghanistan. Example, Iraq. So I think this is the beginning of the end of the so-called American empire. And remember that Americans, the population, no interest in it. Americans just don't care what happens beyond their borders. That's the problem. We have too many Americans who have consigned responsibility for our foreign and defense policy to a very well-financed minority that wants to rule the world. And Americans are not really interested. So I think that's the other part of this equation. And if you look at our borders, you look at the invasions that we're sustaining from South America, Central America, from around the world, the developing world, you look at the rise in criminality inside our country, the drugs, the human trafficking, this can't go on. We're not good.
They're not even Mexicans coming into the US. They're people from Afghanistan and all over the place.
Well, I think we already have a third or more of the Mexican population living inside our borders. Okay. So I'm not sure the Mexicans have too many more to send. Yeah. When you go down to Nicaragua, El Salvador, Venezuela, that's where you see more people coming in. But you're right, we're getting large numbers of Africans, people from the Caribbean basin, Haiti especially. Also large numbers of people from the Middle East. And naturally, no one is vetted. No one knows who these people really are. Then we pay each of them $2,375. Then we give them a free ticket to any place they want to go in the United States. What a solution. They show up in states and cities around the country, and the states and the cities are hard-pressed to maintain themselves as it is, given our financial situation. Now suddenly they have another 50,000 people who they don't know, who are not Americans, who expect to be taken care of. This is all nonsense. This can't go on. So, you know, it's, somebody said, I think it was Ben Stein, things go on until they can't, and then they stop. Well, I think we're getting close to the point of stopping in the United States.
Well, now we have the business going on in Israel and Gaza as well. I've heard people saying this could be the end of Israel. What do you think?
Depends on Israel at this stage. They're just as I have tried to outline the situation in the United States as it pertains to Ukraine and potentially other places, it also frankly pertains to Israel. We've sent or dispatched 2 carrier battle groups. That's about all that you're going to see show up. I don't see any evidence that we'll send very many forces ashore, even if the Israelis ask for it, which they normally do not. We don't have significant ground forces to send. You could send a battalion of Marines there, but that's a gesture. It's not going to be meaningful. The army that we have today is smaller than the force the Israelis are assembling right now to deal with Gaza. The Israelis are assembling an army of 470,000 because they've called up 320,000 plus reservists. Now, what are they going to do? That's the real question. And right now, it appears that Israel is governed largely by emotion, not reason. And that's understandable. The horrors of the last few days in the behavior of Hamas, which is sadly nothing new. We saw that with the Islamic State, did many of the same things. But now that it has happened to the Israelis, the world is shocked. I'm sure Europeans are somewhat shocked, but then again, you have Muslims in your country, and we're quite aware of the violence of which these people are capable. What Israel has to think about are the consequences of widening the war. This thing is not contained. And the Middle East, the Near East, is also different today from what it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. The states are actually stronger as entities. The populations are much more aware of what's going on around them. They have more influence over their governments. And then, of course, you have the Turks, who somehow or another escape notice because the Israelis obsess over Iran. We have no evidence whatsoever that the Iranians triggered this operation by Hamas. None. This was stated by the National Security Advisor, Sullivan, one of the first intelligent things I heard him say. And virtually everyone else in the West who's looked at events has said, no, Iran is not behind this operation. Now, the Iranians lent some assistance to Hamas from time to time, yes, but Qatar really finances Hamas, and Qatar also finances Turkey. And Turkey is the leading Sunni Muslim country in the region and probably in the world. To tell you that the Turks are quietly enraged by what they see happening would be an understatement. Mr. Erdogan is watching all this very carefully. He's raised questions about the carrier battle groups. The Iranians have said very little. The Iranians have said, certainly we support our brothers in Hamas, but the Iranians are not rattling any sabers, and they certainly aren't making any threats to Israel. On the other hand, everyone else in the region is. Hezbollah has said that if the Israelis go into Gaza in strength, as they have advertised, that Hezbollah will attack Israel. Well, the Hamas had 5,000 rockets to fire. Hezbollah has 40,000 rockets to fire. Hezbollah is infinitely better trained, much better forces, poses a real threat from the north. Then again, you have Syria, which is a weak state, but under certain circumstances, depending upon what the Israelis do, it is not impossible that the Turks will find a way to intervene. And this brings me back to Egypt. Egypt has said it wants to remain neutral. And unfortunately, the Israelis have told them that if you send an aid convoy to Hamas, well, we will fire on it. We won't allow you in. That would be catastrophic. And now they've already tried to push as many of the Palestinian refugees that are in Gaza into Egypt. That hasn't worked because the Egyptians have no place to put them. And if you put them into the Sinai, how are they going to be housed? We're about to go into the winter. Where are they going to live? Ideally, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates have always had the resources to resettle these people, but have never been interested in doing so. So it's a terrible situation because there's not much the Israelis can do to make the situation in Gaza better for the people that live there. There are problems inside Gaza that are actually independent of the Israelis. At the same time, Israel needs to reassure itself that everyone in the region around them really does hate them. They need to understand that. And you don't want to give your neighbors that hate you an excuse to attack you. So focusing like a laser on Gaza is important, but you've got to be careful what you actually do because it could get worse. And I would not rule out if Egypt is somehow or another dragged into this, if they are attacked in some way by the IDF, and I hope to God they are not, I think that the first person to visit the Egyptian government will be Mr. Erdogan, with a promise of immediate military assistance and support. I think that would be the end of it. And the question is, what do we do? Right. And we're not as strong as we were. You know, I keep trying to tell people this in Washington, and even Europeans don't seem to get it. I sometimes think everyone believes that the world stopped in 1991 and that the kind of power that we had then, we still have today. And that's not true. The forces that fought then don't exist today. Our forces are in very poor shape, certainly in no shape to fight a major opponent in a regional war. So the outlook is grim right now for Israel, but it depends on leadership. I think that Mr. Netanyahu is scheduled for removal. I just don't know when that will happen. But the Israelis have to tread carefully. However much they hate what has happened to them, however much grief they're suffering, and I certainly sympathize with them, equally disgusted, but reason has to triumph over emotion. So they need to think carefully through this thing. It's not easy.
And that also brings us to conflicts within NATO. But before we go into that, do you think Ukraine is set up to be an Israel 2.0?
Well, I don't know. I think that Ukraine is set up to die at this point. Let's be frank. Sending weapons and equipment there, it's not going to change anything at this point. We just offloaded 8 HIMARS vehicles. These are the rocket artillery launchers. We have identified 1,000 ATACMS. These are long-range Army tactical missiles that reach out to 300 kilometers with great accuracy. We're going to give those to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians will use them. What will it do? Nothing. It's not going to change the outcome. It may make the Ukrainians feel good if they're lucky enough to hit a target that kills some Russians from time to time or destroys some infrastructure. It's not going to change the outcome of the war. In fact, if anything, it could make matters worse for the Ukrainians. The Russians will double down and make life that much worse for them. So Ukraine is finished. It's done. Militarily, there's not much it can do. Somebody needs to step up and say, enough's enough. We won't do it. No one in Washington is going to stand up and say, you know, we made a terrible mistake. You know, we were wrong. Russia isn't weak. We always thought in financial terms. We said, well, financial powers equal dollars on a spreadsheet. Not really. Real economic power stems from resources, cheap oil, gas, minerals, foodstuffs. What has Russia in abundance? All of the above. No one thought that through, and no one understood the Russians. The Russians, gosh, are different from us. They react differently. They think differently. You would have thought someone with a brain would have sat down and said, this is not going to produce success with the Russians. But we didn't care. Washington never cares what others think, because we see ourselves as the men in the white hats. We have all the answers. And the answer is be like us. Be like us. Join us. It's almost as bad as Genghis Khan, who used to say, join us or die. Well, we say, join us or starve. Join us or go broke. Join us or we'll sanction you and we'll make you miserable. I think the world's tired of it. It's over.
Yeah, I think the West has this, I see this in Sweden, this idea that everybody wants to be like us. And the only reason they're not is because they haven't progressed that far yet, but they're striving to be like us and have our decadent values. And I think it's the same in the US. I've lived in the US and I've seen the same sort of mentality. Do you think this could also mean the end of NATO? I mean, I'm thinking of all the new tension with Turkey, for example. Turkey is still blocking Sweden's entry into NATO, and the Hungarians are on the same side as well. But I mean, with the Israel thing now and Sweden always following the US, supporting Israel, and the Turks maybe supporting the other side. I mean, does this work in a military alliance like that?
In January of 2022, I was interviewed by Dmitry Simes. He's a well-known Russian historian, thinker, political scientist. He's retired now, not far from where I live. And he asked me about this question of NATO, and I said, NATO will not survive this crisis. And I stuck by that. I never thought it would. First of all, NATO was never designed to wage offensive warfare. It wasn't. It was always designed to defend Western civilization, Western Europe. Suddenly, we expanded it and kept expanding it with the goal of trying to turn Russia, ultimately, into a facsimile of what you just described, Sweden or something else, without regard to what Russian interests are, Russian history, culture, civilization. It's all failed. And the failure in Ukraine is going to have a profound impact on the rest of the alliance. Members of the alliance are privately realizing that they exist to do whatever we want them to do. Well, that's not what the alliance was about. Remember that Eisenhower was very reluctant to become part of NATO. He didn't want it. And he said, if NATO still exists in 10 years, this is when it was founded, that would have put them in the early 60s, then we failed. The whole idea is bad. It failed because we have not found a better way forward with the Soviet Union. Now, that was 1955, 56, Eisenhower. Here we sit, and this thing has endured. It's endured largely after 1992 because we wanted it to, and we convinced our European allies that they needed it. And they tended to agree because they saw some benefit to being part of NATO. They said, well, we have another channel to Washington, D.C. There's a way for us to extract goodness and benefits. After all, the Americans will come here and defend us, and we don't have to spend as much on defense. We can also work trade deals and other things because of our cooperation through NATO. Well, that's gone by the wayside. Who wants to be part of an alliance that drags you into a war with a country that is not your enemy in behalf of another country that is irrelevant to you, that's not even in your alliance? I mean, that's effectively what's happened. It's not because anybody loves or hates Ukrainians or loves or hates Russians. These are just facts. So I think the Swedes ought to send off a thank you note to Mr. Orban in Hungary, and even send a thank you note of sorts to Mr. Erdogan with the PS, how would you like all of our Muslims?
Yeah, I thank him every day. I mean, but Swedish politicians are, of course, as stupid as the rest of them. And they're always late to the game. So they want to desperately join this alliance, just like they want to join the euro, which is also a dying project. What would a NATO membership even look like for Sweden, do you think? Would it be more than yes,
well, you have
American nuclear weapons pointed at Russia?
Obviously, everybody immediately says, well, then you are part of the nuclear umbrella. But I have not been convinced for many decades that the United States would risk nuclear confrontation with a major nuclear power over a village somewhere in Poland or a small town in Germany or France or anywhere else. I just don't see it. Now, there's another portion of this, though, that is very dangerous. The Finns, whom I always viewed as at least rational in the sense that they understood the value of neutrality and they'd managed to avoid all these wars since the Second World War, would never have even thought seriously about joining NATO. But now they've not only joined NATO, but they seem to be receptive to the idea that the U.S. military will establish a base in northern Finland within short range or striking distance of Murmansk, Archangel. What a disaster. I mean, why would you do that? I keep asking them all the time, are there Russian forces massing on your border? Did you capture plans from the Russian general staff in Moscow indicating an imminent plan to overrun Finland? I mean, after all, the war with Finland went so well the last time. Why wouldn't the Russians want to repeat that experience? It's just stupid. It's back to this question of why would the Russians want to rule Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Finns, Swedes, anybody? Forget it. It's a lot of trouble. The Warsaw Pact became as much of a vanity project over time as NATO has been a vanity project for Washington. I mean, let's face it. By the time the British left India in 1947, India was a vanity project for the British Empire. They were no longer extracting the huge benefits from their colony that they once had. That's one of the reasons they left. Of course, their debt to GDP ratio in 1947, thanks to us, was 240%. Well, our debt to GDP ratio is up over 120, 125%. People say, well, that's not very much. Yeah, but there's a difference. We're talking about a $33 trillion sovereign national debt. And if I went into the details about privately held debt and foreign held debt and so forth, suddenly it would dawn on everyone, this is a catastrophe. So we're in a very different position. Everybody says, well, we've been down this road. We had problems in 2008. We had problems in 1994. Ladies and gentlemen, the United States is no longer the nation it was then. And the level of indebtedness is astronomical. We didn't face this in the past. So I think anyone who thinks they're going to benefit enormously or strategically from joining NATO at this stage who lives in Europe probably ought to seek therapy.
Can't you see Turkey coming to the rescue of Sweden when Russia attacks?
Oh, I think once they realize that they can go up there and do what their co-religionists are doing, especially with all the lovely and attractive people in Sweden, I'm sure they'd be delighted. But no, you're right. It's absurd. And the Turks know that privately. They are a paper-only member. Their views, their agenda is 180 degrees out from us. The only thing that we should be interested in as Americans, frankly, to the extent that we can have them, is good relations with the Turks, simply because they are the 800-pound gorilla in the Middle East. Now, that may or may not always be possible, but we should seek that. But the notion of making them an ally and expecting them to come to our aid, I mean, this is something President Trump said when he was in Japan. He said, this is a wonderful country. He says, I'm so impressed with it. Why are we defending Japan? Japan can defend itself. And oh, by the way, there's no agreement on the part of the Japanese to come to our aid in the event that we are attacked. It's a one-way street. So, Americans are waking up slowly to these realities, but I think when the financial system implodes, they'll get an ugly education. In the meantime, I think that the Swedish government ought to have a referendum.
Yeah.
Put it to a vote.
Yeah, but they've kind of veered away from those democratic ideas that people should have a say in things. So it kind of
they might not go along.
Yeah, that's the risk. Yeah, another problem with NATO and alliance like that is it's a in economic terms it's a tragedy of the commons. People think that everybody else would come to their aid, everybody else would pay for their defense, the US would pay, everybody else. So why bother? Everybody will help everybody else, but then nobody has anything.
Well, what I tell my German friends is that the solution for Germany is to be German.
Yeah.
Stop trying to be some sort of Euro nation that exists to, do penance in perpetuity for its role in the Second World War. Oh, by the way, Adolf Hitler could never have done anything without Joseph Stalin. But no one ever brings that up. The Russians aren't going to apologize for Stalin. I think it's time for the Germans to stop apologizing and just be Germans. Germany is a perfectly reasonable, rational, logical country. It had 12 years roughly, with a maniac in charge. We all know that. That's unfortunate. It's over. Go back before that, and Germany was a very wonderful country. It's a wonderful country now, but they've got to think about their own interests. I would tell the Swedes to do the same thing. And just because you're a nationalist doesn't put you in opposition to someone else outside your country. That's nonsense. It just means that you identify core national interests that are uppermost in the minds of Swedes or Germans or Frenchmen. By all means, do that. Then decide how far you want to go, just how far you're willing to mortgage your security to someone else. And I think if they do that, you'll end up with a better solution than this thing called NATO, because NATO's outlived its utility.
Yeah. You know what the solution is to the national debt? Just write it off. And the government will never be able to borrow $1 for generations again.
I don't know. I think what you could have, though, is that you could have an international debt summit. And the people, of course, standing in the way are all bankers. Yeah. Because they will not profit.
That's right.
So I think that's something worth doing. I think that a lot of that can be done, but at the same time, you don't want to write it all off, because we need to restore fiscal discipline to our countries. We've spent ridiculously profligate. Our thinking has been foolish. So we need to develop the discipline we once had. And I think we can do that. So you don't want to erase the entire debt, because that'll force you down a better road. That's my view. And eventually you could get going again. The Germans renounced the debt in 1932 and 33 that they owed to other people. They said, that's it. It's gone. And, if they hadn't foolishly gone to war, they were on the verge of an enormous age of prosperity. Yeah. And it's unfortunate. And this is true for us. It's true for everybody. War is overrated as a business proposition. I wish people would wake up and understand that. There are a lot of sunken costs in all that military equipment. I mean, how do you profit from it? You want to resell it? Maybe you'll resell some of it, but you're not going to get much return on your investment. So you only want to build what you really need.
I mean, Adam Smith in the 1700, whatever, realized that everybody can benefit in a business, but in war it's only one side, if even one side. Just one final question, and before I just want to read your quote. It goes like this: "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." That's Paul in the Bible. And I believe this is a spiritual thing that's going on. And you've started an initiative called Our Country, Our Choice. Or is it your choice?
No, our choice.
Our choice. Would you just tell us a little bit about that?
Well, this, I will call it for short purposes, OCOC, Our Country, Our Choice. We call it OCOC. It was founded by a group of people who decided, and I was not one of the founders. I was asked to come on board by some very smart people and try to make this a nationwide movement. And that's what we're working on. But we said three things. First of all, we're tired of all this Republican Democrat nonsense, because the truth is, it doesn't matter who you vote for, you get the same damn policies. So we have in Washington this thing we call the Uniparty. The Uniparty is owned by various lobbies. Some of those are corporate, some of them are foreign. Some of them are, pharmaceuticals, different kinds of things that for different reasons have found a way to essentially buy up politicians. We know that has to go away. I think it will as a result of where we're headed financially. We also said we've got to return to a very simple formulation, faith, family, country. Faith, family, country. One of the things that we've seen with this government that we have is a systematic attempt to destroy the family. It's incomprehensible to us that now we want the state to determine, what children learn to believe is real or unreal. That the state controls not only, our lives as adults, but is going to enable children without consulting their parents at the age of 7 to engage in self-mutilation and transform themselves, they think, from, a boy into a girl. We think that people that are willing to do that sort of thing to anybody who's under the age of 18 should be treated as criminals and go to jail. So when you look at the things that concern us, we want to end these pointless wars overseas, stop the interventions. Secondly, we want to restore the rule of law. We can't go forward, indulging criminals, as you know from your own experience in your own country. You do it. We've got to stop it. Mao had a saying: shoot one, educate a million. When you watch people loot and commit crimes against fellow citizens, you shoot one, and you'd be surprised how much attention that gets on the street. Everybody else suddenly says, "Oh my God, I better stop her. I'm going to be shot." But we seem to have lost our intestinal fortitude, our guts, our courage to do what is necessary to protect our society. So we've got to restore the rule of law. And in connection with that, we've got to close our borders. We've got to round up all these people who've come here illegally and expel them. We can't afford them. We can't employ them. They're not coming with skills that enable them to assimilate. We've long since breached the limits of assimilation as it is, but we'll go under completely if we don't stop what's happening now. So these things have to happen. And then we absolutely must halt the sexualization of our children. Teaching sex classes to third graders? Good Lord, I don't remember anything remotely sexual about being in third grade. What are we doing to ourselves? So, now you're talking about an appeal across party lines. We're saying, look, there are lots of good people, Democrats and Republicans, who can agree on those things. We need to come together, and we need to go after these people in Washington, push them out of office. We need to force this agenda that I just described to you onto Washington, get out of this terrible pit of despair that we're currently wandering around in. I mean, does that explain it?
That explains it. Yeah, you're talking to a country where homeschooling is criminalized, and where we have a core curriculum for the entire country, which includes sex in every subject. So, we know what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, there is a movement afoot in some European countries. I won't mention them, but they're further south from you, who are very interested in basically our continent, our choice.
Yeah, I know some of them. So.
And I think that's damn good.
Yeah.
And that makes sense. That's a European project I could support. So I hope that we will see chapters emerge elsewhere.
Yeah, I'm positive. I'm sure we will. And I'm sure you will do some very good things in your country. And with that, I thank you for your time this time and hope that we can meet again.
Also gern geschehen. Hoffentlich sehen wir uns wieder.
Ja, das tun wir. Danke.
Bye.